Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guests today are Regis Kelly and Douglas Crawford, who built the startup ecosystem for the biotechnology industry in the Bay Area that has helped launch hundreds of companies, created thousands of jobs, revenue for the state of California, and last but not the least, delivering immense value from science to the world. The leadership helped bring science to the forefront of the business sector. While building one biotech company is a big deal, building a whole ecosystem that makes launching startups much easier for aspiring founders for generations to come is even more consequential. In Doug's words, you just need a credit card, a solid scientific idea, and a team to launch a biotech startup. They usually take care of the rest of the core infrastructure and support system to build your startup. That is how easy they made it. In this episode, we will talk about the trials and tribulations building QB3 that started over 2 decades ago, the challenges they had to overcome, the evolution of academia and biotech startups from the 1970s to the current day, and the challenges going forward, macroeconomic conditions that are shaping the funding and growth of the sector, government policies, lessons learned from the Massachusetts biotech ecosystem, evolution of new research centers like the Arc Institute, Altos, and others, and finally discuss ways to move technologies out of academia to benefit the society. I've known Doug and Reg for years, and they both were featured previously on my show. The timing of this episode is great because Reg recently stepped down as the director of QB3, and I thought it is a great time to capture his journey building this ecosystem along with his partner in crime, Doug. I consider myself lucky to have them both to tell the story, and I'm really hoping you'd enjoy this show. Thank you, Doug and Reg. This is going to be a different kind of a conversation compared to my previous episodes of my podcast because I wanted to cover the story of the biotech startup industry in the Bay Area that you two trailblazers have been building it for the past 2 decades, over 2 decades now. And I'm going to call this episode The Past, Present, and the Future of the Biotech Startups in the San Francisco Bay Area and its implications for California, US, and the world. And the right framework to start this conversation may be to talk about how you two started working together. Doug, maybe you can start this because in our last conversation, you said, Rich called me from this bar in Mexico.
Exactly.
I wanted to start QB3 and you started working together. And also one statement that I read about, Reg, said by you is, there are a few people who are more inspiring, who are more capable of saying, let's get out of the foxhole and go towards the machine guns. And all of us happily got out and followed him. Give us some context.
Yeah, that idiocy really wiped out people in World War I, right?
We're all still standing, fortunately.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was a seminal event in my life when Reg called me out of the blue from a bar in Mexico. Terrible phone connection. I don't know if the beers had contributed to that or not, but called me and said, hey, Doug, the chancellor's asked me to step in and take over QB3, would you like to join me? And of course, I said yes instantly and was one of the happiest opportunities of my life.
What stage of your life were you in when this question was asked, Doug?
Well, it's kind of funny. I have an unusual path that brought me to where I am today. I sailed professionally for a long time and didn't go to college, which actually, I'm not allowed to say that to my son, but it's pretty smart because when you're 20 years old, you can drink all night and have a good time. And most people are in school and then working. And when they finally retire to their boats, they're no longer able to go to the Bomba Shack and have a good time. So I started with retirement and now I'm going to work into the grave. So I had come to graduate school. I think I was 40 when I went to graduate school, so high 30s, something like that. And I went because I wanted to be a bricklayer in the Cathedral of Human Knowledge. I had these very noble ambitions of being useful in some long-term sense, not being a great contributor. Then I spent graduate school poking worms in the side of the head and asking, "Are you alive? Are you dead?" I was studying the regulation of aging, and it's a tedious process to say the least. So I didn't think that the particular part of the brick wall I wanted to build was poking worms. And so I was so ready for Reg to call me, though I didn't know that that's what it was going to be. And so now I'm a bricklayer in the startup company universe rather than the worm universe. So that's
Fascinating story. Reg, why did you pick Doug? At that point in your life, you had so many people that you could have called. How did you pick Doug?
Well, actually, I remember when Doug's application came through our application file for graduate school, because since I was a sailor at the time, I was
Ah,
had this credential. That wasn't his only attractive feature. So then I was on his committee and I heard him give a presentation of it. But the unusual thing is Doug had actually gone and worked in our technology transfer office and had some experience. He'd volunteered there. And so that already showed it's one thing people to talk about having an interest in something. It's quite another to actually having demonstrated it. So to have someone who's this obviously smart graduate student who was motivated, as you can probably tell, very articulate, and also had some experience was really valuable. I have to say, though, that to be honest, when we started, I had no idea where we were going to end up, and it was certainly not where we did end up. We were supposed to Institute of Research and Innovation, and I came from research, so obviously I emphasized that. And mainly we tried to think about ways we could put together to support research programs across campus. That was sort of the original idea of the people who founded QB3. That's what they would do. It turned out that, in fact, it wasn't very useful because the amount of money we had to distribute didn't move the needle at all compared with the amount of money that faculty members in QB3 were already going. So, as you well know, you can't do anything without money that's significant. And so we gradually, and I have to say, largely through Doug's influence, became much more involved in trying to get involved with innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think the key thing that's triggered it all, we had this little space on our floor with a little label on it that said incubator, and nobody knew what that was there. Nobody gave us, by the way, Naresh, any instructions on how to run QB3. It was complete whiteboard, blank sheet, right? We could almost anything. And so we had this room marked incubator, and Doug set that up as being the incubator very successfully within a year, and that triggered the whole of our development. So it was not based on us sitting down having these deep thoughts and trying things. It was more jumping in, trying things and see what happens. And fortunately, what Doug tried was setting up this incubator worked extremely well. And that was so well that inspired us to go and set up a venture fund. And that was therefore really more or less initiated, at least in the University of California, the ideas of university-associated incubators and venture funds. I think we were, as far as I know, the first people to do that within the UC system. I may be wrong, but as far as I know, that's the only one. We were the first.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue to talk about the story of QB3 itself. As leaders, what did you have in the vision, short term and long term? And what would success look to you at that point? And how far you came since you started that?
A little bit of a bait and switch here went on. To be honest, the QB3 set up under Gray Davis at the time, it wasn't very clear what it was there for. But if you read its statements, it was saying, well, we want to do things that people haven't even thought of being possible yet. Well, of course, that's always a good thing to say. It's not like machine learning. We're going to learn something we don't know from our machines. You know, it's a nice approach. So there wasn't really any specific guidance. I was brought in because my predecessor, for various reasons which I prefer not to discuss, had actually not done a very good job. And there was huge battles going on between Berkeley and UCSF. And people on the president's level and Office of the President were really getting very upset at QB3 for what they were doing and what they were not doing, including the person who had initially encouraged Governor Gray Davis to start QB3. He was saying that we weren't doing very well. So I was more or less brought in as a fixer. Can I do something to fix this? And actually didn't quite know what we were doing. I was busy, as you hear, sailing and drinking down in Mexico when this came up. So we just had to more or less make it up as we went along. And so the idea of, QBT adders to driving the bioeconomy, that didn't come from Gray Davis. That came from Doug Crawford, right? That was his mantra. He put that, and that became our mantra. But nobody ever told us to do this. We just made it up. You don't ask for permission. You just go ahead and do something and apologize later if necessary. We've never had to apologize for that one. But we never got permission to say we were driving the California bioeconomy.
Doug, what did bioeconomy mean to you at that point? I was just looking at some data from a macroeconomics point of view. The country of US spends about 20% of its GDP on healthcare. That's a big amount. And for me, that's bio, because I've been trained as a scientist. What did it mean to you at that point, and how did you build on that? Because nobody told you got to do these things. There was no job description.
First of all, we define the bioeconomy very broadly. We're happy to, the obvious solution set are in therapeutics and diagnostics, medical devices, those sorts of areas. But we were completely open-minded to the idea that biology was and is now making a huge impact on material science, energy, agriculture. And so we took a liberal view of what the subject matter could be. I think the thing that really drove us was this sense that there was a capacitance gap between cool ideas, cool people, and the realization of those ideas into benefit to society. So in the mid-2000s was kind of a bleak time for the biotech industry in the Bay Area. We don't really remember that very well today, but there were 2.5 million square feet of empty lab space. There was a dearth of venture capital investments. No one was roaming the halls, cultivating ideas from academic labs the way they are now. And UCSF in those days was receiving, I think, roughly $750 million a year in federally funded research and only producing maybe 2 to 4 startups a year. And I know that the measure of the university is not singularly based on number of startups, but it is a good metric for benefit to society, since you cannot improve the life of a patient without a company between the academic world and that patient. Somebody's got to productize and see regulatory approval and all of that. And that cannot happen in an academic context. So if you think about that, $750 million at the top of the funnel and 2 to 4 startups a year at the bottom of the funnel, we thought there was a tragedy there in unrealized potential, both for the technology and the people. And that was the experiment we tried to run with the incubator. And as Reg said, it was a success that we had no reason to expect, but enjoyed. So for us, the bioeconomy is the vehicle by which public benefit accrues from the increase in human knowledge. Wow, that sounds grandiose, but I think that's true. Would you agree with that, Reg?
Yeah, and another thing which I can remember Doug and I having a very animated discussion about this is who's going to come into our incubator? Because almost all of these things, anybody sets up incubator on the university, they're doing it to try and help their faculty or their students or their people, or you might say the University of California. But as Doug just said, there really wasn't enough companies coming through, even UCSF, to make it worth setting up a structure, right? It just didn't make any sense. So if we want to think big about this to go, what we had to do, if we wanted to have a fund and have an incubator, we'd have to open up not just to people coming out of the University of California, but to make University of California resources available to anybody, any company that wanted to be in California and have their base in it. And we rationalized that, saying that we as QBT was created by the legislature, not by the university, to help the state of California. And we would help the state of California by bringing in companies from all over. That was actually fairly unique, and it's still relatively unique. When the people like MIT, Harvard, and Stanford, when they run these incubators, they're primarily for the faculty and people coming from their own institutions. So because we were created by the legislature in a different way, not by the university, we actually see ourselves as using the university to help the state rather than using the other way around. Never again asked for permission for that. Remember that discussions, Doug, about whether we could do this or not? And we just decided, what the hell, let's just do it and see what happens and see if anybody complains. We didn't ask, as usual, for permission. We just did it. And it's been the characteristic feature now. And so just as we mentioned in the Baker Labs, even when we're doing this, it's still very unusual and unlike the place because actually our most recent company comes from Singapore. So we're worldwide in doing this.
Wow. Let's take a step further back. Let's divide the history of biotech industry in the Bay Area from 1970s to 2000s, and then from 2000 to 2022. If you had to put up chapter headers for each of the stages of the biotech startups, how would that look like? And Herbert Boyer and Robert Swanson, these were the champions. Reg, I read somewhere in one of your interviews that you were not too supportive of Herb Boyer starting companies because it's a private company. What changed your mind, 180 basically, and you becoming a champion of startups?
Well, let me reiterate my mea culpas. I was wrong about that, but I was in good company. Keith Yamamoto, who is now a chancellor, he even wrote a book about how evil it was. And the idea was, and it's still around, although it's a diminishing belief, that science, purity of science, doesn't want to be contaminated by money. And that's the whole thing. And that one of the things is we decided not to go into business, went into academia because we wanted to do entrepreneurship, wanted to do good things for science, all that sort of usual stuff, which meant we weren't these evil capitalists driving around in their limousines, right? That was complete nonsense. And I don't know if I told you, but for me, it was a very important thing. I was invited by someone from Chiron, which is Bill Rutter's company, to go to a Christmas party over in the Old Asian Art Museum. And I went in there, and my first time going to one of these events done by a biotech firm, and there were several thousand people crammed into this place, coming from all ethnicities, all social strata there, having a great party. And there, Bill Rutter had created 3,000 jobs for these people who were all doing very well and very happy. And meanwhile, I had been sitting feeling very pure in my lab, though I'm not contaminating science. Now, it was a little bit contaminated because the woman who invited me to go to that eventually turned up to be my wife. So it might be there was a little bit mix-up of emotions in that area, and she worked for Chiron. So, but anyway, that was for me the epiphany that made me realize that my previous attitude towards this had really wasn't right, that Bill Rutter was doing more for society with his capitalist goods than I was doing with my socialist leanings, standard academic socialist, semi-Marxist leanings.
Yeah, I just wanted to stay on that subject before we go back to my original question. Doug, maybe if Reg changes mind, if we were to en masse change the minds of a lot of people who don't still believe, the faculty, should we just invite them to all these parties, startup parties, and see what would the solution be? Our approaches should be?
Well, I think, as Reg said, the resistance to the idea of commercial outcomes for the academic work that are shepherded by the folks who actually make the discoveries, resistance to that whole process has really waned in the last few decades. And I think Reg and I should feel some small sense of pride for having contributed to that improvement in public thinking about that. Because the real point is to help patients in society. And I think all faculty members see that. They don't want deep, hard questions to be ignored for quick gains. And that's a fair point. And so that tension, I don't think, is quite as strong as it once was, because we find many more investors very excited by big, deep problems. So I think the world has come together. And I like the way you framed it before, too. If you think about Herb Boyer's work back in 1976, there were so many things that were amazing about that. First of all, that Bob Swanson found that PNAS paper and inferred the commercial potential of that technology. It was non-obvious. Bob deserves a huge recognition for those insights and for his ability to wear Herb down to get him to make a commitment to do the company, which didn't come easily. And then secondly, they were public in 5 years. And that's pretty amazing story for a trailblazer. There were not predicates that made that easy for investment bankers to go on the road with that story. So extraordinary events led quickly to a lot of investments in biotech. And then there have been several periods of rather disappointing results from biotech investments that have then cooled the markets, and then they rebound. And so we've just been through the hottest period in biotech's history in the last 10 years, 12 years or so. We're in a bit of a cooling phase at the moment, but long term is always up to the right.
Let me just add to that, Rich, a little bit, that in defense of the faculty who went these things, they really were worried that curiosity-driven research would be sacrificed at the altar of the translational research, applied research. And that's a very valid concern, right? But as you recognize it as a concern and say, yes, and all of us who are trying to do applied research realize there has to be basic research. The data in favor of having unfettered basic research is really strong. So it's actually no threat to that, but that was a concern that many of the faculty had. We would be belittling the importance of basic research, which we haven't done. But I have to say, it's actually, Doug is a little bit overly optimistic when he describes the lack of hostility towards this. I live in academia. I just watched two of my colleagues from my department, Peter Walter and CMHR, go over and start Altos in Arcadia. And they did not have a good departure from UCSF. They tried to make it a smooth one. They tried to say, keep offices to try and deal with their graduate students, try and make the graduate students things. You're going out into the companies. You're either in or you're out. You can't have a foot in both camps. So, there's still a sort of an animosity to people about these people because it's this expectation that people are going out industry to get rich. They've lost their belief in trying to do good things. That's false. It still is around quite a lot, unfortunately.
That's too bad.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue to talk about this new Altos labs and Arcadia establishments that are coming up. I see a lot of good hope of new developments. What is your take on such multi-billionaire people throwing money at these institutions? Do you see them as a competition to academia or complementary establishments? What is your take? And we don't know what's going to come.
I think you're right. There's potentially a threat to academia. A lot of philanthropy money who wanted to try and do something for health would put money into endowed chairs, into training programs and stuff, or new buildings, labs in universities. And instead, they're putting into these groups, which are called delayed profit companies. They don't have to make money for 10 years. They've got enough money to carry them through. So it's a little bit of a rebuke, I think, to universities. And it's one of the arguments I use about why the University of California should be doing things like the Baker Labs. If the universities don't evolve, they're going to be left behind. And that's true of most institutions worldwide. You've got to be prepared to evolve. So I see that. I'm using those as a way of trying to argue the universities should evolve in some way. The other part of it, though, I think it's really exciting. I always love new things. But it's an untested idea. We're used to the idea you work well in academia to get promoted and to get grants and so on. That's a well-established career. You're used to going into industry where the markers, you make money for your investors, so you get more money and you keep going. Those are two well-established ideas. This intermediate ground is somewhat different. So you go in as an employee into one of these delayed profit organizations. You're not an academic. You're not in it to make money. What are you actually there to do? I believe it's a bit of a problem. It's a very exciting experiment, and both Peter and Simi are very good friends, and I'm trying to help them with that. But just watching Calico, which is one of maybe the first of these delayed profit ones to come in the Bay Area with large amounts of money. And in general, it's whether it's a success or not is very much up in the air. I haven't seen any evidence that it has been a successful model yet. And having heard a little bit indirectly from people who've left Calico, it's not working up to expectations, at least to my expectation. The expectations were really high. Remember, it was on the front page of Time magazine for a while. Does that agree with your assessment, Doug?
Well, the first question about the competition, I'd say, well, forgive me, I've always been an iconoclast. The purpose is the public benefit and not the institutions that have traditionally been convened to serve that public benefit. So if the institutions become sclerotic, then alternatives would be welcome. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they'll be extraordinarily complementary. So we'll have universities, we'll have private research institutes, we'll have companies, we'll have lots of people trying to solve seemingly intractable problems of health and environment. And more is better. More money is better. More people is better. More alternative ways of structuring research and thinking is better. There's several things that are really challenging about working in an academic environment where you're mixing training with research, and there are a lot of benefits of that, but there are the differences. The metric of publication is maybe not the most productive metric in all settings, and certainly not the metric by which companies operate, and they can do very well too. So I think it's great to see a diversity in approaches. That would be my take on that.
I want to apologize. I didn't mean to give a negative take to that. I definitely see this as a complementary infrastructure that is coming up, much needed. Bigger challenge in academia has been a lack of funding for new ideas, maybe. Maybe we need such institutions to explore new ideas. Doug, maybe on the subject of academia, can you talk about the evolution of academia from pure academic focus to entrepreneurship and how that is progressing and where that needs to be if you had a magic wand?
Well, here you have to think about this in terms of the context. So the problem we set out to solve in the mid-2000s of there being a large capacitance gap between scientific discoveries and very wonderful entrepreneurial scientists and the opportunities that they had to turn those ideas into value were very limited in the mid-2000s. Today, that's not so true. So in other words, today there are very active interest from groups like QB3 and Baker Labs and NBC Biolabs to provide early startup space. But there's a huge venture industry keen to now make very early stage investments in technology companies. And that's continuing at a slightly slower pace, but still continuing at a very aggressive pace, even after recent declines in the public markets. And so I don't really worry about the struggling entrepreneurial scientist in the Bay Area finding pathways to turn their idea into a successful company. But these are rare environments. Boston and San Francisco do not represent the world. And so most of the good people in the world, most of the good ideas in the world are still falling on parched, dry dirt and not getting a chance to grow. And so would love to see the models that we've developed here in the Bay Area be proliferated around the country and world. And it's always been one of Reg's dreams, is that we would be Pied Pipers of this sort of activity.
Well, Doug, I don't know if you read, I think last week's Economist, but there was an article saying that the future for Britain is to try and invest in life sciences entrepreneurship. That's what they're good at, and that's what they should do. And what they described and how to do it was almost exactly from our playbook, almost word for word, about what we're doing. And what was particularly interesting, the person they got as the guru to comment on this was Fred Cohen, who used to be one of the advisors to QB3 in the early days. So that's the London Triangle, Oxford, Cambridge, London. That's trying to compete with the Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the California entrepreneurship ecosystems.
You are indeed the Pied Pipers. And one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast with you too is really to tell that story, like how you both evolved and your observations that others can benefit and not repeat some of the mistakes or things you would have done otherwise. Maybe we can talk about topics that you would like to do differently if you had the chance to go back. Hindsight.
Well, there's some companies we should have invested in and some we didn't.
Yeah. Can I have tomorrow's newspaper for a year?
Actually, one of the things, I was an evolutionary thinking, and at least in my thinking, was that we got all excited about synthetic biology for a while, because especially when the biofuels thing came up. From my point of view, was thinking, because we hadn't thought about this deeply enough. We were really used to thinking about life sciences entrepreneurship as driven in the medical world, where cost of goods is not an important factor because what you charge is a way beyond the cost of them. And when you go into the synthetic biology, it's a commodity market where you have to get large volumes to try and get margins on that. And so when people started getting into biofuels initially, but actually into several other types of synthetic biology, and now people getting into food technologies in the same way, the non-meat foods and things like that, It's not realizing that a big difference between commodity markets and the medical markets and these things was a difference. It took us a while, too, for Doug and I to appreciate that the difference between the diagnostic market and the therapeutic market, even within the medical world, is very different. So you have to realize in the world of entrepreneurship, there's all sorts of flavors depending on which field you're in. And the longer you're in it, the more you realize there's not a cookie cutter solution to all of these things, which can apply to all the things. So general courses on entrepreneurship, not of that much value. It really is focused on a particular discipline in which you're trying to be entrepreneurial.
I think I totally agree with you, Reg. Sitting in the classroom is not the place to learn entrepreneurship. The question you asked, Naresh, my answer is going to sound really arrogant, but I don't think I would do things differently. The thing that I'm saddest about when I think back over the last 15 years is how long it took to grow capacity. Reg just opened a beautiful big incubator over at Berkeley, the Baker Lab. And we have 3 sites now. We'll have a 4th site in January, February. We'll have a 5th in 2024. There were a lot of entrepreneurs whose journeys were made much more difficult by the absence of early stage startup lab space. And goodness, if I had a crystal ball and could have known that if there was any way we could have acted faster, I would have. That's about the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I've been there. I could not get lab space for a long time. Are you working with MRSA? Are you working with CDIF? Can't do this on a regular bench. You need a special facility. But before we move on to this topic to another one, Doug, you mentioned about being able to spread this have-to knowledge to other places. How are we supporting, as a regional growth organization here, how should we best work with startups and partners from elsewhere across the country or globe to build their ecosystems or bring them here? What is being done?
Well, I think it's tough because people come to the Bay Area and they want to port those models to some fictitious little town in the Midwest. And that's not going to work because you don't have the rich ecosystem supporting it. So by the time you get out of these primary markets into tertiary markets, you're really going to need much more public support, university support, municipal support, that sort of thing to get these programs going. But it would be a very wise investment for humanity to do that. Just in the same way that Congress has not allowed all of the NIH budget and NSF budget to go to the top 10 or 20 universities, because in the long term, it would be really beneficial to society to be encouraging diversity and spread and growth in that research capacity. So it would be great to see incubators, university-based venture funds, all of that in every community in the country. It would require public support to make that work, to make up for the difference in the ecosystems.
Thoughts, Reg?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think we're all trying to figure out how the pandemic has changed the way we do things. Before, I would argue very much, things tend to, you have these centers of excellence and you get gradual spread diffusion of creativity out from those centers. And that's been the model of all the various places now. But that's because venture capitalists wanted to go on the boards, wanted to be able to drive to the companies to see them. There was local proximity was much more of a driver for us before the pandemic. We've got more used now to trying to conduct business. So you don't know whether you're talking to someone here or in Qatar because it's all on Zoom. So a possible evolution that might not break down this sort of focus around certain hubs is the capacity for us more and more to be using this electronic communication. So that might make it easier to get away from before. I agree completely with Doug. You have to have everything local to make it work. But maybe that will change in the next few years. I don't know. It'd be worth watching.
Yeah. Speaking of COVID, I think if you go back to the history of Silicon Valley, the valley grew because of the Second World War. Is COVID going to be that incident in our history that is going to fast forward drug development and other bio development? Because I don't think the vaccines would have been approved without COVID the way they were approved. If we can touch on the subject, I think regulatory aspect has been huge in terms of moving things forward in a good way, but there are bad ways too. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And how do we fast forward this one?
Yeah, we never stopped, of course, because of COVID. We never missed a single day of work. Everything kept going for us. The labs have always been super busy. And so we operate in a bubble. It's not that I didn't know COVID was happening outside of the labs, but it didn't slow us down. What it's meant for the industry is, yes, there was an explosion in venture dollars that came in no small part due to the success of Moderna. Thank them for that. But drug discovery and development is a long, hard game. It's not for the faint of heart. And I'm not sure that that's changed. Reg, what do you think?
Yeah, I just say I really don't know. I'm just trying to think, well, because the model is very well defined. Clusters, putting hotspots for development has worked. And it's lots of places that come in and said, what's your secret sauce? Why can't we do this, something like this in Mumbai or something like that? You just can't put together the infrastructure that we have, the ecosystem that we have in the Bay Area. It's not reproducible easily. It takes a long time to build up. That's been the common dogma until recently. I just don't know whether that might change as a result of this change in the way of communication with people. I'll be long gone before we know whether there's going to be a significant change in the system.
Let's slightly shift gears and more into focus on the startups. There's a general commentary that there's a high failure rate in startups. And I hear good things from Doug that a lot of companies that go through QB3 and NBC Biolabs, they have a high success rate. Are the founders doing something different 10 years ago and now? How have the founders evolved? Are they more resilient? Are they more knowledgeable? Are they doing things differently? What has your observation been?
The industry's become profoundly more capital efficient. So our raison d'etre has always been to rent laboratory space and fully functioning co-working labs in units as small as a single bench at a cost per month that could be borne by a credit card. And so, wow, traditionally, had the three of us wanted to start a biotech company, we would have begun that odyssey with a PowerPoint deck, a drive up and down Sand Hill Road. We would look for $5 or $10 million. 99% of us would be sent home. The few that would have been given the money would have then had to go find lab space, make tenant improvements, get permits, buy equipment. They'd be 6 or 10 months and a couple $1 million poorer before they did their first experiment. By contrast, companies moving into Regis or my facilities can do an experiment in their first week. Actually, if they do it in the first day, I give them a bottle of champagne. So space is now turned into a huge fixed cost into a very flexible variable cost. Wow, that's a big deal. That empowers lots of people who were being told no on Sand Hill Road are now being told, yeah, just do it. And then you complement that with the disaggregation, if you will, of the preclinical services. So now you can go to Charles River or Meesbro to do your own animal work. You can go to Wuxi or any number of others to do synthetic chemistry. It's been an amazing evolution to now a credit card is a sufficient source of capital to start. And in that context, failure is become really rare. So in our labs, it's less than a company a year. It's about a company a year. We have 109 companies, maybe one a year totally shuts its doors. Is that because everything always works for our companies and there's so much art? No, the capital costs are so low, they can swing the bat again. And they do, and they win. It's great.
So looks like space is oil in this industry, like how the industrialization was moved forward by oil. Space seems to be moving startups forward.
Exactly. I think all those services and space have transformed the path between an idea and a development candidate, maybe even an IND. The next chapter in the story hasn't gotten much easier. The clinical development costs remain very high, but we can get through to the starting gate anyway.
I would think there's another feature that's really helped change the whole thing, besides what Doug caused. When we started all of this, it used to be faculty members at UCSF would tell whether they'd patent anything, because often that was against them getting promoted to show they weren't focused on their work. And the people in academia and business really could almost hardly communicate with each other because they talked in different languages and had different precepts. What's evolved over the last 20 or 30 years here is a culture that barrier has more or less disappeared. There's enough people who can communicate across the interface between business and academia. It's a much more smooth transition. And again, going back to this cluster thing, what I find all the time is I'm almost inundated with people who are like myself, failed retirees, like people who've been doing entrepreneurship all their life. They don't want to do it anymore, but they really want to help the young people get started. So, and people to get across, to go over the valley of death between academia and business. Now, so much easier because there's so many guides that are eager, asking us all the time, or anybody we can help to do this. People who are willing to come in as interim CEOs for a while. I was just talking to someone this morning who was up volunteering to do this. So we have lots of people also who are facilitating this that didn't exist 20 years ago. But you mainly, of course, that's another advantage of having a cluster. We're very rich and experienced people who can give this almost pro bono mentorship to the young companies.
Interesting. Speaking of businesses, how have the biotech and the pharma industry companies in there evolved in terms of working with academia? Are they where they're supposed to be, in your opinion? Are there things they can be doing better to move things out of the lab faster, more efficiently?
Well, there's two sides to that coin. One is company to academics for research partnerships. And the second one, which is the one we focused on, which is academic out with a startup. The first, the collaborations with academic institutions are still fraught with way more friction and expense than is beneficial to either side of that equation. It would be great if it were better, faster, cheaper to be able to partner with an academic researcher. But that's another story and not an area that I've focused on very much. In terms of getting companies out, that was where QB3, Reg, and to a extent myself went into this relative desert and said, well, gosh, space, we opened the QB3 garage. Money, well, let's do SBIR training classes. Oh, you don't have a company? Oh, let's do the QB3 startup in a box. Whatever it took, encounter a problem, try to solve it. And so that whole process has really helped. The other thing that's hugely helped is role models. So now every faculty member knows a faculty member that is successfully engaged in small company in some way. And so it's very easy to find role models of success. And then the one that I always love is students and postdocs. So you look at a guy like Dan Widmer, who founded Bolt Threads in our garage a decade ago or so. And the day he graduated, got his PhD, was the day he moved downstairs and into the incubator. Actually, it could have happened a little bit before then, but that's another story. What an inspiration to other graduate students and postdocs those role models become. I think that's probably as potent an agent of change as anything, is the begin with the belief, I can do this. I can do this because others have done this.
I also wanted to focus on the relation between startups and established biotech and pharma companies. Are there models evolving where I was talking to David Kern from 4D Molecular Therapeutics, and he built a company, Ignite Therapeutics. It was a build to buy model. They worked with pharma company from get-go, and they were funding it. And once they hit some milestones, they take it on, move it forward much more efficiently. Are you seeing any models evolving like that? And what could a new model be if you had your way?
Well, the build to buy is hard. It was a really good idea. The reason it's hard is writing the if-then statement. So if I get here, then you will do this. Well, if you have to do that in advance, just imagine that you have to do that with your spouse If the person looked like this, talked like this, walked like this, boy, that's a really hard if then statement to write. You know it after the fact. And so we haven't seen a lot of builds to buy. And actually, I'd have to say it is really hard to imagine pharmaceutical companies being able to be more than emotional supporters of startups at that nascent stage where they come out of the university. They really need year, 2, 3, 4 years of maturation before they're substantial enough for a pharma to chew on. Having said that, these are wonderful days where pharmaceutical companies are now increasingly participating in investments, purchases, option deals with preclinical companies. We've seen lots of those sorts of deals in companies in MBC Biolabs, and that's been a very healthy trend. But for them to do that at the academic spin-out stage, I think it's too raw and unformed for them to really make a judgment about.
Yeah, I think Doug is what ideally would be wonderful is more money going into the university to do proof of concept research, post NIH, proof of concept to try and prove this idea really has commercial viability, to do it within the context of the lab that just made the discovery, because you could do that a lot more efficiently. So that would make sense logically. One of the troubles in doing this is just exactly what Doug pointed out. The universities have this incredibly avaricious attitude towards this. We want to get as maximum money short term out of our science. And so they make it very difficult if something comes up to work with the company in a way that's beneficial to society, not just beneficial to university. So that, and Doug is completely correct, but I've spent 20 years, 30 years failing to do anything about how to improve the university's technology transfer offices. That desperately needs doing, but I've failed and I don't see anyone who looks like they're succeeding on it yet. So I can't see that one coming through very much. What is really nice, though, is almost all the major pharma companies and stuff have their own strategic investment firms that are willing to invest. And since they're not in it primarily for the money, but to try and keep tabs on what evolution, they're actually often more likely to fund companies that are high risk because they don't necessarily have to make a lot of money out of it. So big pharma is most useful in the aspect of their venture funds more than anything else right now, more than their business development offices.
Yeah, absolutely. And staying on the subject of startup ecosystems, one of the important aspects of that is going to be workforce. What are we doing in the Bay Area and California in general to build the workforce? So take, for example, the cell and gene therapies. You're going to need people trained, specialized in specific areas. What's happening on that front, Raj?
Well, Gavin Newsom gave each of the institutes $5 million to spend over 5 years to try and check out ideas of increasing the workforce improvement, right? So what we are trying to do with that money, and we see this as pilot, 5 million is far too little to get this going to anything workforce development. But can we use it to place interns in startup companies? All of the previous placing of interns in companies have been to put them into like Genentech and so on, because Genentech can afford to pay them for the summer. But actually, the interns can, I think, learn a whole lot more by being in a very young company. And also, they're often much more valuable. Berkeley undergraduates, graduates are really very talented. If they were to work in our local startups, and that would be the whole of the Bay Area community, that would, I think, be good for the early companies and very good for very practical workforce development. As Doug said, you don't learn by entrepreneurship by taking a class. Getting in there and spending some time doing it is by far the best experience to do it. Dave Schaefer is running our internship program that we spend the Gavin Newsom money. Would like to do it well enough that we can go back to the state and say, look, you should be doing this on a much bigger scale to try and do this. Now, the other sort of, in a particular area now, very practical one that would like to do it, almost everyone in the pharmaceutical industry and elsewhere says we're not getting enough people trained in AI, machine learning, and so on. They're all being sucked up by Google and Facebook, and they're not coming to us very much. And they would like to see more people. So can we take major universities like Berkeley or Stanford, who have got incredibly good students in these areas of machine learning and artificial intelligence, can we in some way get them to be interested in taking their skills into biotech labs that very, very much need them right now? So within the just internship program, mainly to try and use the resources of California to get more people with digital science education into our biotech community. Are you seeing that, Doug?
Yeah, it's a challenge to recruit across that divide. The other challenge that we'd love to play a role in solving, I keep saying it's not just the technologies we want to encourage, but also the people. And so our labs have been tremendous catalysts for people to self-define themselves as entrepreneurs and have done a great job in doing that. And that has really broadened the landscape of who as well as what can be a company. And 44% of our companies in our labs are led by a woman. It's just great. Having said that, I think with the industry, the academic enterprise, everyone is acutely aware we need to increase diversity further. And we're working hard to be able to do that in our own small way. We just launched what we call a platinum ticket program. We've always had these golden tickets where our pharma partners can facilitate a free lab bench to a startup. And this initiative ties our fund activity into the lab activity to say you can have a bench and $250,000. And we're particularly interested in using that as a vehicle to encourage diversity.
That's a phenomenal move. Congratulations and thank you for that. And staying on the subject of training workforce, do you see any ways to train our grad students and postdocs? I think technically they're sound. Do we need to train them in any other ways to be ready for working at a startup company? Do you see any void in that space?
That's a good question, Arjun. We think about it quite a bit. One of the issues that you see a lot here is people coming up with a technology and to knowing what is the best application of that technology within the work, to matching up with a real need. So almost all the students all learn about cancer. So everyone knows that's easy. Cancer affects everything. It's easy to conduit into cancer, but there's so many diseases which are, cancer is getting less and less important as a disease. That's still where all the money's going. And so we need to try and get students a little bit knowing, like take fibrotic diseases. More people die of fibrotic disease. How many people are studying fibrosis? There's no fibrosis center at UCSF. There's no fibrotic center at NIH doing this. So you have areas which there's a huge biological issue where there's no focus on matching a science up to an existing need. And that, I think, has to change. And this is one of the ways we try to think. What can we do in a major university that would make the students more aware where there's huge needs that are there and accessible right now? Even in psychiatric diseases, there's some amazing stuff coming through. And the trouble is our faculty members don't know what the needs are either. They all know about cancer, right? So they always use cancer when they're trying to give practical examples of their use. So the students don't hear what are the things. We tried to do this, Doug, remember some time ago with the anti-medical school with Mark. We tried to do a course over in Berkeley to try and teach what is not known, what you don't get taught in medical school because medical school don't know. That got co-opted, as many of our ideas do. It got converted into something quite different. These are the major unsolved problems in medicine or in agricultural technologies and stuff. To get people to take their technologies and know where the real needs are would be something we don't know how to do, but we're trying to figure out how to do it.
I would say it's not an educational thing. I'm going to go back to this idea that role models are really critical to this. So one of the things that the QB3 Garage did is provided everyone walked by it. They saw these people who were working there and they went, boy, they look a lot like me. If they can do it, I can do it. And I think it would be cool if every UC campus had a life science incubator filled with role models, or if not on campus, immediately adjacent to campus, like the Baker Labs.
Doug has heard me talk about this ad nauseum, but one of the thoughts that when I was back working with Janet, down at Napolitano, I really wanted to push this idea of an academic innovation center. It's like an academic health center. It's a business, a hospital, work with an academia and the standard things. And it works beautifully together. They're great for the students. They're great for the patients. They work well. take away the hospital, replace it with an incubator. The students then get direct experience, as Doug was saying, to actually see the entrepreneurs, to see that like themselves. They also get to hear the sort of problems, the diversity of problems that are being attached. And also, I think, from the people doing in the incubators working on new things, it goes back to the scientists saying, look, these are areas which are really ripe for scientific investigation. You should put some work into it. So I would love, and I am hoping that Berkeley will be the first prototype of this idea of an academic innovation center being the evolution, a step beyond an academic health center in the same way.
Yeah, we do a bad job of telling about the role models. Maybe every grad student coming to their PhD program should have a course for a grade. They need to pass that to pass the quals. Just going through what people have done, I think we need to normalize company formation just like becoming a professor, saying this is a path. I don't think we do a good job around that. Anything in that space will really helpful. Reg, I'm going to slightly shift the gears. Where does California stand in terms of competition and biotech startup space compared to Massachusetts? I think that's the big one on the map. And are there other ecosystems doing really well?
Yeah, we talked about this. So I don't know if you, I mentioned this. I became good friends with the woman who ran the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center for 10 years, Wyndham Bannister. And we talked a bit, because I'm head of QB3, how could we try and adapt this to some way to do in California? So with Don Parata and Lenny Mendonça, we actually have 2 years spent working on what we call the California BioInvest Initiative, which was to put $200 million a year based on the models of a very successful model Massachusetts had put in place to try and do things. I won't go through that, but the key parts, what we learned from Massachusetts was they didn't want to put money into Harvard and MIT. They were already richer than Croesus. But what they really wanted to do was to try and use that to develop manufacturing jobs in California, in Massachusetts, particularly in western Massachusetts, where there was a decrease in manufacturing abilities as moved out of the country, and did that really successfully. Almost all, they had $100 million a year going into it. They put a lot of money into creating manufacturing facilities and the CROs that would support those manufacturing facilities. So now Massachusetts is way ahead of California in almost every metric, even though they're 7 million and we're 28 million or something. So they're ahead of us. So I tried with Dave Baltimore, Jennifer Doudna, and a bunch of people who were fairly well prestigious to try and get the legislature to at least explore this idea. And it never got onto Gavin Newsom's desk, or if it got onto his desk, he was too busy running for president to do anything about it. Anyway, that was a disappointment. I've not given up. I'm actually talking to someone from GoBiz tomorrow about it. But I feel, as ex-head of QB3, it's our responsibility to try and make ourselves at least come equal and be as creative as Massachusetts. And one of the things that I would like to see, whether or not this happens, is related to what Doug was saying. This whole thing, which is a clear embarrassment to us, is the lack of underrepresented minorities as CEOs in our companies. Women we're solving, right? That's not so much a problem. And so one of the ways of doing it is to adapt this thing that Massachusetts does so well. What they have is a loan program to help people get started. It's up to $5 million for 5 years, 10%, 2% per year interest rate. They've had only 2 defaults on the time that Sue Wyndham was running this program. So it works extremely well. Why is it so useful? If you look at when Doug and I see the same thing, you're watching kids starting their company, it's all fools, friends, and family that support them, right? So they've got families and friends, they've got wealth. If you come from a poor family, you don't have that type of friends, right? Even so, you're often burdened with college debt. The average college debt for African Americans is twice what it is for whites. So you're carrying college debt. The thought of going and taking a risk and starting a company, whereas going and taking a secure job in Pfizer, it's no question which you'll do, right? So to level the playing field, what we need to do is to have a loan program that's designed for underrepresented minorities, well run, as Massachusetts was, and it doesn't come just with the money, but with mentorship, which is available for people who have got college debt, underrepresented minorities, because currently it's only the middle class and upper middle classes that can start companies, and that's not correct. And a lot of talent is being lost because of this system. So even if we don't get the CBI thing through, I'm going to work hard in trying to get a California loan program, and I'm talking to Fiona Ma, who's the treasurer of California, about doing something of that sort.
Thank you for all those efforts. Doug, Are there lessons that you learned from Massachusetts? I know you operate there too. Is the DNA of the founders or the operators different from those in California?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's a great wake-up call for California to realize that it's not a birthright for us to be the center of the universe for entrepreneurship. And the case, Kendall Square, is a fascinating case study on several levels. First of all, so you have to look back over the last 25 years and say, well, why did that happen? And the role of MIT in encouraging real estate development in allied industries was really helpful. Rich, that was Sue Hochfeld who was really the champion of that. Is that right?
Yeah, she was, yeah, Sue Hochfeld, yeah.
So that's the role. The other thing that's been really interesting is one of the things that started to happen in the mid-2000s was pharmaceutical companies closed down internal research programs, opened up smaller research programs at the neighborhoods of academic centers, and wanted to turn maybe half of their new drug discovery and development programs into outside innovation. So these were New Jersey and European-based companies largely. So they didn't come to San Francisco, they went to Boston. And that had a transformative effect on startup activity, which I would not have predicted, but has happened. And that's really interesting. And so we should work hard to encourage co-localization of commercial enterprises and our academic institutions here in California, something that's hard because of the neighborhoods, but we should do whatever we can to encourage that. Another issue is, in general, you might ask, well, why, Doug, did it take you so long to build new labs? And you would think that it would be the capital required to do that or our view of the tenants, and neither of those were the issue. It's just super hard to get permitting to build facilities. And if we could make that easier and build more mixed-use neighborhoods, I think all of that would help. It's a good question.
Yeah, the regulatory aspects of our government change a lot of things in terms of, I was reading something about the number of planes we built pre-Second World War and the amount of time we spent on building F-35 and the budget is just mind-blowing. And I really, really hope that some changes happen in that space. Slightly shifting gears, I think what you guys built is the ecosystem is thriving with a lot of incubators, accelerators in the Bay Area. And sometimes it is confusing for a newbie coming into a startup world. What should I do? Where should I start? And sometimes it so happens that founders go from one accelerator to the other one, 2 and 3, giving up equity at each of these spaces. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, just because the business is that with life sciences startups take a long time and they need more time to raise money. And so they're going through all these incubators. Any thoughts on that process of what is a good way for a new founder to go through?
Yeah, so Reg and I set up a program to avoid Walking Dead. We said, well, you can't be with us longer than 2 years. And we carried that program across to NBC Biolabs because there was huge opportunity cost. If you let someone stay longer than that, you're saying no every month to numerous entrepreneurs looking for space. But you raise a really good point, which is you're by no means likely to be ready for the commercial real estate market after 2 years. Even if you're 15 people and you've raised $15 million, you're not ready to sit down and sign a 7-year lease on 15,000 square feet, even if you can find it. So we are taking a slightly different approach. We'd love to build enough space to allow companies to get to 15, 20, 25 people and really extend this capital efficiency through to the doorstep of clinical development. So we're right now 78,000 square feet. We'll be at 110,000 square feet in January. We'll be at 210,000 square feet in 2024. And by no means are we stopping there. So hopefully we can build enough inventory so that companies can have more flexibility.
And you're doing this on sort of the Lilly model where you can actually take as many modules as you like, because they're full, you can get in there, right?
No, that's one of the lessons we learned, Reg, in the very early days. I won't say who, but there was an incubator that preceded us in the Bay Area, really just one. And I went to visit them. And I went to some of the entrepreneurs there and I said, oh, this is so cool. How much interaction do you have? A lot of conversations with your neighbors? And they said, No, don't know who any of them are. Like the New York City apartment where you live for 10 years and you don't know any of your neighbors. And so Steve Blank has a good view of this. He says people view startups as big companies shrunk down, and they're not. They're very different beasts. You and I created an open plan co-working laboratory. Wow. No one, to my knowledge, had ever really done that before. And we didn't do it because we were smart. We did it because we had one lab and we didn't want to rent to one company. And so we, out of necessity, chose that option. And that has proven to be a huge advantage. Why? First of all, it provides for a much more gratifying intellectual and emotional and cultural environment to be in a really active place. Secondly, it means that your costs are totally variable. Hey, I hired a scientist. I want one more bench. So you're not spending a single penny for a resource that you're not using. And then, should you ever need to shrink, the same is true. We would like to extend that co-working concept up to companies who are 20 or 25 people. When Electra raised 60 million, or Pioneer did the same. Electra raised 90, Pioneer 60. Each of them came to us and they said, can we just have one more bay? And it was like, no, you have to go. But really, one more bay would have been wildly more efficient and productive for them at that stage.
Fascinating story. Well, I think we're coming to the end of this story. You both have been phenomenal leaders building this ecosystem. Reg, who are the other leaders? Are you grooming other leaders to fill your shoes and keep this going?
I'm not grooming anyone. I'm just selecting. Biological process of selection. You don't train. You just look around to see who's good. So the person who's taking over for me and the head of QB3 is Dave Schaefer, who's already started. He's on 8 or 10 companies. He's used QB3 to help start Forty, and so we've known him for years. He has got lots of practical experience. One of the things when you're doing a university-associated incubator, that's what I'm doing in contrast to what Doug is doing, it's really important to keep an academic in a lead position, because if it goes over to be running by the university administrative element, that's a sclerotic dead end. That's not the strength of universities. But finding an academic who's willing to spend some time trying to focus on entrepreneurship is a challenge. And I would love to think, Naresh, that we're not grooming people, but showing examples of how people can be successful in this area. We might try and do it, but it's not a big pipeline. There's not people falling over themselves to compete with Dave Schaefer to be the head of QB3. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And like down in Stanford, although they're doing their big incubator there, I don't know. I talked to Mark Tessier, and they're trying to do something very big down there too. But it's not led by the academics so much at this moment. I don't know who the academic leader of innovation entrepreneurship is down in Stanford. It's Daria Mosley Wilson. She's not a faculty member, I don't think. Anyway, I think there's a dearth of people. Naresh, keep listening. Maybe you can be that person. Maybe you're learning all this stuff. Use it like this.
Yes, we both have been role models, and Doug has been helping me for a long time. Doug, do you see any other leaders in the Bay Area?
It's been very hard in recent years to compete with it. So one of the challenges we have is people keep getting excited to go start companies. And so they get siphoned off into the other side of the fence, or they get sucked into investing full time, operating in this sort of milieu of startup space and funding is a special character, a couple of weirdos like Reg and me, and I don't know how many more there are like us out there, but there are more, hopefully, all the time.
Well, we'll find them. You both must be spending ungodly amount of hours on your work in building this ecosystem for the past 20 or 30 years. How do you balance family and life?
What is that word? Do you know that word, Doug? Balance?
I think the real thing that we don't talk about enough is a life that is filled with purpose. And the great thing that Reg and I enjoy, which too few people get to enjoy, is work that's really gratifying and meaningful. And I would love to do gratifying and meaningful work 24 hours a day. And I would put my wife and son in the same gratifying and meaningful category. And so I have a very simple life. I work out, hang out with my family. So everything else is gone. I couldn't tell you anything about the news. I've expunged any news time out of my life or that sort of thing. It's very gratifying. I have had a wonderful run of it.
And I had a slightly different approach this March. When I was younger, I did all these crazy things like whitewater rafting, kayaking, aerobatic flying and stuff. I did all my fun things when I was young. So when my body was in good shape, but now that my body's old and not so good, it's fine for me to do just as Doug says, to spend some time with my family and some time working. The key thing though, and this I think actually, first heard this, I think from Cynthia Kenyon maybe, it's really important in your life is to think you're having fun. It's what you're doing. No, it was Carla Schatz actually says you've only got one chance to live your life and you better make it a fun life. And I think what Doug and I do is actually really fun. And it's really great to be on the cutting edge and to be trying to do things people haven't done before, to try and look and see, well, can we do something? And there's no guide, so you're making it up as you go along. It's maybe the old explorer myth. I think I would be very unhappy just running a standard big company. That would be not what would appeal to me. So one of the things I learned on my sailboat, the reason I quit doing this and ended up calling Doug and coming back, was realizing when on my sailboat, all I was doing there was gratifying myself. I had no purpose other in life than gratifying myself. So I was just waiting to die. I was of no consequence to anyone. And that was really not a very happy place to be. And to realize not being on my sailboat in beautiful places, but actually being in QB3 and doing useful things actually makes me happier. And it was a realization that happiness doesn't come the way it's sold in all the magazines by sitting on the beach having your margarita. That doesn't work, right? Happiness comes from feeling you're still useful.
Thank you for coming back. Any parting encouraging message for faculty, students, grad students, and postdocs and undergrads likewise to take this path of startups?
Don't wait, just do it.
And one of the things I think I mentioned to you before that's important for me, because being on Berkeley, I have to watch my political flanks a little bit more. The fact that now we have a tremendous collaboration with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is trying to do good. We're currently working on a similar thing with the ADDF, the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, and they're coming to work with us in the belief that this is entrepreneurship for public good. You do this because you want to help society. So I think trying to change away from a very contaminating idea that the only reasons for doing this is to make money. And if you're not interested in make money, don't do it. That was a very deleterious idea. So the more we can get young people convinced that this is the way to actually change the world in a good way is what being an entrepreneur. That's what I'd most like to see happen.
My last question from my side is, are there people who played a significant role in helping you get this far in your journeys for the past 2 decades?
Well, for me, it was Reg, of course, a Reg catalyst, and it was not planned. I had no grand schema. He called me from Mexico and it set in motion a whole series of things. And I'm extraordinarily grateful to Reg for all of those opportunities.
And I have to say that QB3 would never have got off the ground without the combination of us working together. We were a really good team and it was a wonderful 13 years or something to work together. I have to say, from my own point of view now, working with the university, mainly, which is a challenge. The key thing is to have a donor behind you, someone who's a powerful figure, because you go and knock on the doors of a vice chancellor, say, oh no, Berkeley doesn't do that. But then if your donor calls up and says, well, I hear you can't do that, and I'm not sure if I'm interested in giving money to you if you can't do. It's amazing how doors open. So for me, I've been incredibly helped by Barbara Bass-Baker, Brooke Byers, and Jack Wadsworth, who was very much helping Doug and I in the early days. So those people who really have stood by us through thick and thin, they have been incredibly helpful, and I'm incredibly grateful to them.
Totally true.
Excellent. Reg and Doug, thank you so much for your time and sharing your story. Really appreciate this. I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy this show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nurse.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.